Do you ever feel like time isn't quite right? I mean, I have 3 cats, so I know exactly when every mealtime is. Believe me, they will let me know. But for other people, I assume it's a very common feeling. Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. And for today's video, I want to have a quick conversation around a discourse that I saw coming up around the A24 film I Saw the TV Glow that came out earlier this year to huge accolades and became a sort of big discussion piece, especially within the trans community, because of how much the film was a very clear, overt transgender metaphor, and even more specifically, a metaphor for transgender people who are figuring themselves out and possibly, or may not, be choosing to break their egg and come out as trans for various different reasons. I really loved the film. However, the trans community has had a very visceral reaction to it across many different lines that I've found utterly fascinating. Some people have hated the film. Some people have loved the film. Some people have not really related to the film as a trans person. And then there's been people outside the trans community who have either like completely understood the trans metaphor but didn't relate to it. People who have not understood it and fully related to it. Like the spectrum of reaction to this film has been all over the board, and I think that's to its credit. I don't think I've seen a single person say that this is not a film that makes you that doesn't make you feel things on some level, whether you love it or hate it. And I think that that's an interesting conversation about whether art should be enjoyable or not, but certainly has been a piece worth discussing on many, many levels. And Jane Schoenbrunn, the director of the film and a non-binary person, has made a very interesting piece when it comes to making queer and trans art within the Hollywood apparatus. And one of the discourses that I've seen come out around the film as it sort of made its way onto Max and has been getting seen by even more people and made more available is this discussion, especially within the trans community, that the film never says the word trans. That it's a film that is so overtly a transgender metaphor and yet never overtly talks about transgender people. And even arguably, if you want to just take the film at a metaphorical level or even literalize some of its more fantastical aspects and science fiction horror elements that are in there, it could quite possibly not be read as an overtly transgender piece with like a specific transgender character. And I find that to be a very fascinating reaction to this film, that people are sometimes upset about that fact and kind of wish the film had done that. Because I personally feel that it is very important that this film does not actually explicitly say the word trans or explicitly go about its way to say, like, this is a transgender character. And I want to discuss why I feel it's important. And it's going to be kind of building off something that I discussed earlier last year, I believe, in a video I did over on my main channel called How Hollywood Corrupts Transgender Stories. Go and watch that video if you haven't seen it, because this is kind of going to be building off of that a little bit. You don't have to have seen that video. I'm going to try and keep it there, but this will be building off a lot of those ideas, and I may even touch upon them in here. The other thing I'll say before I get into the meat of this is I'm not going to try and spoil every piece of this movie, but I am going to be talking a lot about the themes, maybe in some specific scenes, maybe in some towards the end of the final big decision. So if you have not seen the film, just know that I am going to be discussing that. I'm going to try to avoid as much as I can, but I think I'm going to need to get into some of the meat of it at some point here. So just fair warning on that front. But with all those caveats that I said, let's dive into this. The film is very overtly transgender, even without the word trans. I mean, the film is seeped in transgender colors. Like, one of the first shots of the film is the main character as a kid going underneath one of those like parachute things that we would all do in the 90s if you're my generation, and sort of like float up and the colors coming down, and it's a very clear transgender colors. And the rest of the film is stuck in that sort of like pink, purple, white, blue, like light blue sort of code with a little bit more of like a purple pink feel to it to kind of fit the vibe of the film. But it is very, very transgender colored in a lot of its visuals. But even beyond that, like, Jane Schoenbrunn themselves has even stated in interviews, like, this film is just visible enough, and they're just visible enough as an overtly transgender, non-binary person, that if you're not seeing that this film is a transgender metaphor, you're kind of deliberately missing the point of the film, or you're just completely removed from all context of the film. And so it is weird to me that people are sort of like, oh, it's afraid of saying transgender, which is something that I saw some people say, because I don't think the film is afraid of being trans at all. It is very clearly steeped in it in very heavy ways. And of course, the main metaphor of the film is meant to be an overt trans metaphor. I mean, you have, again, just a quick recap of the film, you have the Justice Smith's character, Owen, kind of growing older and having been drawn to this television show, The Pink Opaque, which is very much an overt Buffy the Vampire reference, along with like things like I saw Are You Afraid of the Dark and a few others, but most overtly referencing Buffy, seeing themselves in that show. And as they are growing older, literally in the story of the film, being told like, hey, you're the character from that show, the girl in that show, that's you. And you need to kill yourself in this universe to wake up in that universe and defeat the bad guy, Mr. Melancholy, in that universe and wake up as the girl Isabel that you are with these special powers. But even if you remove the literalization of that horror aspect of it, even if it's just like he identifies very heavily with this queer woman, this trans woman, or this woman character in this film, and we see him literally in a dress at one point, and that's the only point in the movie where he's like smiling and happy, and the rest of the time he's just slowly deteriorating physically. He gets more and more drawn into the suburban, 2.5 kids lifestyle that America tells you to be, and he's dying inside, quite literally. Represents a big fear that so many trans people in the trans community have of like, when you ask any trans person about how they felt, myself included, before they came out, and you ask them like, what did you feel when you didn't think you would ever be able to come out as trans? You feel like, well, I thought I would go out and have the 2.5 kids, but really emotionally I was dead inside and didn't know if I was going to make it. Like I myself, content warning here, was suicidal. And I won't get into the specifics about that, but like I didn't think if I saw, there came a point in my life where if I saw myself having to continue down that road, I don't think I would have had the energy to do it. I would have died inside. So it was very much a come out or don't make it, even though I tried to lie to myself and said I could. And that's very much what this film is overtly about as a metaphor. And I think that's very clear in that fact in a lot of ways. So I don't think it's necessarily afraid of it, but there is a question to be made about why does it not say trans in the film? Why does it not have an overtly transgender character or make these statements more directly tied to like, this is trans? And I think there's a few reasons for that. And I think that there's a few reasons that I'll get into, but there is one that I think is the artistic reason to do it that I think is very deliberately done. Or at least one that I think is is what's important to me for why this film didn't do it. If I didn't necessarily want to put it on Jane Schoenbrunn and sort of assume authorial intent, but I think it's probably a very important intent for her. But the most overt one that I think people are reacting to, that they think it is, why the film does not say trans, and it's an understandable one on some level, which is the fact that maybe they were told not to by a Hollywood executive. I mean, we look out at other transgender representations in film and media, and you'll see like there's a transgender character. I bet you didn't know this. There's a transgender character in the Spider-Man live action Sony movies with Tom Holland. One of Tom Holland's classmates is trans. Bet you didn't know that because who gives a crap? No one knows that Tom Holland's classmates' characters' names other than Zendaya and Genki, I believe is the other. No, that's Miles. I don't even remember his best friends' names in those movies. But other than those characters and Flash, you don't really know any of the other ones. And so it's like they go like, hey, we have a transgender character, but don't draw attention to it. And that's because, they want to be able to sell it in Chinese markets. They want to avoid backlash here in the United States, which is kind of the more overt reason. Like China is usually the scapegoat. Like, yes, that's a reason that they want to sell it there, but like they use that to avoid, anger here in the United States. As we've seen more and more backlash at anything appearing to be woke in media, meaning queer, non-binary, or people of color or trans people being in a thing, that is starting to see more of a pushback because no one wants to be deemed political, like Disney especially. And so you can see a Hollywood executive looking at this film and be like, do we need it to be trans? And I would be shocked if that was something that happened with this movie. Now, certainly, I am betting you what Jane did to get this movie funded is tell A24, hey, this is a trans metaphor, but it's a more open thing than that. People are going to relate to it beyond that. And I think that is a very important part of what this film is. But I think that was also like, I don't think it was her intention to not make a very overtly trans film, but they may have had to sell it that way to some executives. And I'm sure there's someone at A24 who, I've dealt with enough executives in Hollywood to know that there's probably some executive that sat there on the project like, I don't see anything trans in this at all, way up at the top. And A24 is going through its own... Oh, wait, that's Annapurna. But so I'm sure there's like someone up at the top there maybe didn't understand that. But I would be shocked even then. But I'm sure it was sold on the back of this not just being a trans thing, but it's like people who relate to Buffy the Vampire Slayer and wanted to get lost into that world, and kind of a horror film about wanting to get lost in your favorite TV show, rather than and emphasizing that at certain points to certain people who are funding the film. You know, sometimes you have to just sell to the people in the room, and I'm sure that was part of it. And I understand why, you know, people would look at this film and see that doesn't say trans and think that, you know, that was an impetus for why this film doesn't say trans, that it's afraid of saying it because it's diluting itself for a mass market consumption, because that is something that very much happens. But I think what it also signals, and I think this is what the film is kind of reacting to in some ways, is how a lot of our media, when it tries to sell itself as like the queer movie or the trans movie or the trans character or the queer character, or the black character or the like whatever minority character you want it to be, that character becomes about that identity. You know, there are so many TV shows and movies where they have like a queer and trans character, and that's their defining feature. I mean, I love Star Trek Discovery, but in a lot of ways, you know, I think they break out of it a little bit, but like characters like Adira, the non-binary character on that show, is the non-binary character on that show, and that's sort of one of the more, especially in early seasons, one of the more overt things about that character, and they become fairly bland of a character as a result. I think that changes a little bit over the show. I don't want to be too mean to it, but it is a kind of defining way we talk about that character, and an overriding thing about that character. And I think it gets even worse in some other cases that you can point to, and how that just makes queer and non-binary representation very flat and boring and dull, and yet the reason that happens is because we sort of pigeonhole queer and trans people as like, that's what you are, that's your identity. And I see it a lot too behind the scenes. You know, I'm a trans artist. I myself made a trans film. I'm a trans filmmaker. I'm hoping to go out and make more trans films. And I talk with a lot of other trans writers and trans friends of mine who work in the business. And one of the things that we encounter quite often is like when I pitch something, or a writer friend of mine pitches something, they're known as the trans writer in the room. So a show will be like, well, we don't want to hire you because you're a trans writer and we don't have any trans characters. So why would we need you? And I know a friend of mine in particular, I won't name, but who is very upset about the fact, it's like, I write sci-fi. I will add trans characters if I can, and I like writing trans characters, but it's not my main focus. I write characters. Just like a cis dude can write women characters, you know, trans people can write whatever characters, and it's not our defining feature. Now, certainly I would love to write as many trans characters as I possibly can, but it's not the overriding thing. But it's that in my perspective as a writer will be colored by the fact that I am trans, and I certainly have a certain perspective on the world and institutions and storytelling because of that. Like, not exactly a fan of Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, for example, but for numerous reasons, because that's a very cis, like masculine way of storytelling. And Jane Schoenbrun's themselves even talked about how I Saw the TV Glow is also kind of addressing this sort of Joseph Campbell hero's journey sort of narrative, with the main character Owen consistently refusing the call and being a very passive character, and having a very more internal journey rather than the external, like leave your home and come back out and with the elixir sort of journey. And actually, his desire to not ever leave his home, and that sort of being a big thing with his character, without spoiling too much. And so there's this commodification of identity when you say trans or queer, that's who you are. And I see it as myself on YouTube here. Like, I'm known as the trans person. And to a degree, I play it up because I'm known as Jessie Gender. That's my name on this channel. And I do a lot of trans-focused content. But part of the reason of that is, like, I'm somewhat forced to, because that's how I'm able to be in this space and make a living, but it also means it's very difficult for me to break out of that. And the same too with the stories we tell about trans people. And I think this came to a head very recently last year with the discourse around Across the Spider-Verse Part 1. I believe it's Across. I always get Across and Into, but the second Spider-Verse movie. And this is where I talked about in my other video about Spider-Gwen, where even trans people were like, well, Spider-Gwen is gay because there's trans colors around her. Her father may have a trans flag around her, and there's a trans supportive flag in the room, in her room. And just looking at these signifiers for transness, these like symbols of transness that could be bought or sold, or very clearly like label the character as as trans, and then like right-wing anti-woke weirdos going like, well, she's not trans, it's never explicitly stated, again needing like shallow signifiers to deny that she is trans. And I was sitting here being like, well, it doesn't, you could interpret her as cis or trans either way, and I think that that's perfectly fine. She's a fictional character, and I think it adds depth that you can read her both ways. But for me, what was interesting about her as a character was like she was this character who was very much viewed one way by her father and said, you know, you can't exist as a Spider-Man. I hate Spider-Men, Spider people, as it should be said. And when she comes out as Spider-Gwen to him, he reacts first with violence and rejects her, which is a very queer and trans experience sometimes, where people are rejected by their parents for finding out something that they really have no control over. She can't, like, she got bit by a spider, certainly in this universe, but like she doesn't control her DNA that made her that way. And he's rejecting something about who she is. And eventually he turns around to that in the film. And so I sort of sat here and being like, I read that character as like having a very emotionally trans journey, kind of similar to Owen in a different way. Here, actually more closer probably to Maddie. In this, actually, now that I think about it, Spider-Gwen is very similar to Maddie and I Saw the TV Glow, is a character who literally leaves home and then comes back when she needs to sort of save a friend after she's rejected for being queer or whatever. So like there's a very similar vibe there. And Maddie's, I think, more intended to be queer in this film, but like the vibes are the same. And so I like, regardless of whether she's overtly trans, the character very much resonates with the trans experience. And I think that that's the power of art. And while I certainly want like overtly like labeled, like this is a trans character meant to be a trans character in film, that is handled in a way that actually gives respect to a trans internal experience and a specific trans external experience, because, you know, the more specific you make a character, the more universal it can become to all people, not just trans people. Instead of this sort of like bland, like has to represent all trans people and therefore becomes representative of no specific trans person characters. And that's what I saw in that. And I think there was a power in her not being labeled explicitly trans, because it allowed that trolley to get by studios to a degree. And I think there was also power in a secondary way, which is what I think I Saw the TV Glow is doing. Because for me, I think it is very important that this film does not only stay specific on a trans experience. Because yes, this movie is very trans, and I don't think anyone would deny, unless they're being deliberately obtuse, that this is meant to be a transgender metaphor. And yet, I kind of talked earlier about people who are removed from the context of the film and not knowing that, you know, it's meant to be a transgender metaphor, or that Jane Schoenbrunn is a transgender director, non-binary director. And they watch the movie, and I've seen reviewers of the film who don't know anything about it sort of have this like weird moment of like, I relate to this. This movie feels like a dream. And I identify with it, even if I don't identify with the trans stuff. Like Chris Stuckman, who's a reviewer he's a cis dude reviewer who I really, really love. I really respect his opinions on things. I don't always agree, and sometimes wish he could go deeper on some of his reviews, but I generally have a respect for his reviews in the YouTube space. And he even knew about the transgender metaphor, and he's like, I don't relate to it, and yet this movie felt like a dream to me. And his review is fascinating to me, because I feel on some level, while he is overtly kind of pushing out identifying with the trans aspect of it on an overt level, like that label, he is really identifying with it emotionally, you know, through his experiences in his life. Like he existed, I believe he was a Jehovah's Witness in his background. I don't want to over analyze the guy. I'm just talking about his, like, but there's an element of his life that he could bring into it. And I think that happened to a lot of people, that they may not have overtly identify with a trans experience. And especially if you had told them this was meant to be a trans movie, maybe they would have been pushed out more and been like, oh, well, this isn't, I don't identify in this, I don't know. But the film draws you in to say that these emotions that we feel are very relatable. Like, the film is very much dealing with the way America specifically has sort of offered up this like endlessly nostalgic version of America that we can never really achieve. And we kind of want to escape it, dream of a different world, these fantasy worlds that we want to go to. We sort of dream of them, and yet we never feel like we can enact it because we're too terrified of losing the very little that we have at the moment. I think all of us feel that at some way, shape, or form in America, unless you're one of the right-wing weirdos who want to stamp down and destroy empathy and sort of dictate how everyone should exist, whether they're a baby in the womb or, grown human being or woman who's able to give birth, or trans man who's able to give birth, or whatever. Like, just control people's bodies. Unless you're someone like that, like, I think a lot of people feel this way about how they're oppressed and forced to live in this very specific, narrow, rigid view of humanity under the American system specifically that this movie is tackling, and I think that that's important, that the film is not pigeonholing itself off as a trans film by leaving it open to that and not shying away from being a transgender film, but emotionally trying to broaden itself. Because I'm very much a believer in, and I've talked about this in my Dreaming of a Queer Internet video, and I'll be talking about it in other videos, but Jose Esteban Munoz is a philosopher I really love, and he talks about the idea of queer futurity. And part of an element, there's a big philosophy about it, but it's about this idea of dreaming of a queer future. Queer people dream of a future where we are not queer. And to be queer is to sort of have this dream of a future that we want to enact, and we enact amongst ourselves in like queer communities. That is like a mini version of the future of how we actually want the world to be, and we try to enlarge it, make it bigger, and sort of push that dream upon the world, and that's how it becomes the reality. Kind of the same idea that's going on in this film in a metaphorical sense. And the other element of that is this idea of radiating out the idea of who gets to be part of that community, who gets to identify as queer in a philosophical sense, of who is pushed out by society, not necessarily just on sexuality basis, but on many different bases. I was also, that same idea was the idea of Identities, my movie. I don't want to go too far into it to promote myself, but if you saw Identities, which is very much more overt in its queer and trans metaphor, though certainly I also didn't use the word trans in that movie. It was also a film that I hoped would be identifiable to people beyond just a queer metaphor. The Matrix is also a transgender metaphor, but a lot of people felt it, and many people misinterpreted it to be like, you should be the winner of the Matrix, be the one, be the most powerful inside the Matrix. A lot of Andrew Tate-esque folks did that. But the film, I think, tries to reclaim that in the subsequent sequels, and especially Matrix 4, to say, like, no, it's about connection. It's about finding people. It's about moving beyond just the idea of one singular savior, powerful person, but creating communities. Matrix 4 is about that. The Matrix 4 movie is explicitly like saying Neo and Trinity are the one together. It's their relationship, their connection to each other that made them powerful in the first three films. Not just Neo himself on his own auspices. It was their love. The kiss that Trinity gives at the end of the original Matrix. And the fact that the machines also join them in Matrix 4. So, I think that that's an important part of what I Saw the TV Low not saying trans and not being so stuck on, like, hey, this is a trans experience within its film, but not also shying away from being trans too, with the trans colors as being very much a trans director making the film, and so many other aspects of it that signal it being trans, but also leaving itself open. And I think that's why it's a kind of a masterpiece in that sense, of being not necessarily legible to cis people if they are removed from context, but being emotionally legible to them. And I think that is a very, very interesting way to do art. That being said, it's one movie, and it's not going to be something for everybody. Like I said, there's a lot of trans people who have rejected the film, and not in a way that's like, I think it's terrible, but people, I literally saw people on Twitter and elsewhere saying, like, I hate this film. I despise it. Certainly is a movie that I think is well made and doing a thing, but I hate it. And that may be because it's a film that is real. If you watch the end of it, it is, especially if you're a trans person who relates to this type of experience, it is a very visceral film. But then there's also transgender people who I know who are younger than me. Like, this is a film very much made by people of my generation. Jane Schoenbrun's, I think, a little older than me, not too much, but we very much seem to have very similar backgrounds. And so I related to it very heavily because of that. But there's certainly, I've seen younger trans folks who have a slightly different experience of coming up of age in an era where trans was a more known in public thing, like after the transgender tipping point, as they sometimes call it. Not as heavily relating to the film, because it's a very specific experience, but still relating to it on some level. And I'm sure older transgender people, your older generation of transgender folks don't relate to this at all, because it was a very different experience as well. So it's one that even cuts across the trans community within a very distinct way, that's garnering a bunch of visceral reactions. And I think that that's fascinating as a piece. And I it goes this idea as like, should art be enjoyable? People who have an angry reaction to film. And I'm very much it bothers me that live in an age where we like quantify films of like, was it an enjoyable time? Because I think movies sure can be enjoyable, but I think like movies that make you viscerally feel something, they make you think, it may not be something you enjoyed, but certainly something that you think about, I think are very worthwhile. And I think this movie falls into that. Like I would hesitate to say like I enjoyed the experience of watching this movie, but I certainly am fascinated by it. I certainly love it. It's going to be probably my favorite or one of my favorite movies of the year when I make my list. But I certainly wouldn't say I enjoyed it more than other movies that I've seen this year. So yeah, I just wanted to chat about that. I'm kind of rambling at this point, so I'll end out there. But what did you think? I'd be curious about your thoughts. This is just a discourse that I was just kind of fascinated by and wanted to discuss. Felt it kind of touched upon some other things that I've talked about here in the other videos and elsewhere. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. But beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you all live long and prosper.